At exactly 6:47 p.m., a single text message illuminated J.D. Vance's phone screen. The glow cut through the dimming light of his office like a warning flare in the night. Two words stared back at him. "They're moving." It was short. It was blunt. It was the kind of message that makes a person stop breathing for a second, the kind that makes your chest tighten and your mind race through every worst-case scenario you've ever imagined. J.D. Vance felt his heart skip a beat. His fingers hovered over the screen, frozen in that terrible moment between ignorance and knowing. By the time he looked up from that glowing rectangle of bad news, he understood something fundamental had shifted in Washington. The capital city he thought he knew, the political landscape he believed he had mapped out, all of it had suddenly become unfamiliar terrain. Something in the very foundation of American politics had cracked wide open. What followed in the next few hours would make that moment feel like nothing, more than the calm before a devastating political earthquake. The tremors were coming, and they would shake the halls of power in ways nobody could have predicted. Before we go deeper into this story, take a second and hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and let us know where you're watching from. I'm curious to know how far these stories travel. It was supposed to be a quiet Friday in the nation's capital. Congress was headed into the August recess, that lazy stretch of summer when the marble corridors of power empty out and the relentless machinery of government grinds to a temporary halt. Staffers across Capitol Hill were packing their bags, organizing their desks, and dreaming of beaches and backyard barbecues. Lawmakers were penciling in vacation days and town hall meetings, mentally checking out from the pressures of Washington. The air conditioners hummed their steady rhythm in countless offices. Interns made final coffee runs. Senior aides exchanged knowing glances about whose careers would survive the fall session. It was supposed to be ordinary, predictable, safe, but behind closed doors, far from the eyes of cameras and constituents, a dangerous plan was being set in motion, the kind of plan that gets whispered about in history books decades later, the kind that makes people wonder how things ever got so broken. Mitch McConnell, the longtime senator from Kentucky who had overseen the Senate for decades with an iron grip and an unreadable expression, quietly pulled a move that nobody saw coming. This wasn't some political maneuver dreamed up in the heat of battle. This was cold, calculated, and meticulously planned, the kind of chess move that only someone who had studied the game for 40 years could execute. Working in the shadows, McConnell had been building something, a coalition of the willing, they might call it in diplomatic circles. But this wasn't about diplomacy. This was about power, pure and simple. Teaming with Senate Majority Leader John Thune, his political protege and loyal lieutenant, McConnell pushed forward with a scheme that would have seemed unthinkable just weeks before. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications: extend the Senate recess and freeze more than 100 of President Trump's crucial nominations. Think about that for a moment. More than 100 nominations. Judges who would shape the interpretation of law for generations. Cabinet officials who would implement the agenda that millions of Americans had voted for. Military leaders who would command the defense of the nation. All of them frozen in bureaucratic limbo by the stroke of procedural pens. This wasn't some minor procedural tweak, some adjustment to the calendar that would barely register in the news cycle. This was an all-out squeeze, a political stranglehold designed to choke the life out of an administration that had dared to challenge the established order. Staff whispers began to circulate through the corridors of power like smoke through a burning building. The rumors were almost too shocking to believe, but the evidence was mounting. An impeachment inquiry, they said, was being threaded through back channels, not through the proper committees, not through the constitutional process, but through whispered conversations and secret meetings. And here was the most damning part. It wasn't being done to defend any principle. It wasn't about protecting the Constitution or upholding the rule of law. No, this was about something far more personal. This was about choking an administration that had refused to play by the old rules, that had rejected the cozy arrangements that had kept certain powerful people comfortable for decades. The idea behind the scheme was deceptively simple. Stall the judges, and you control the courts for years to come. Block the cabinet picks, and you paralyze the executive branch. Stall the generals, and you leave the military in limbo. Then, when the slow summer news cycle rolls in like fog, let the controversy get buried under stories about beach vacations and county fairs. The architects of this plan figured they had calculated everything perfectly. They assumed there would be little blowback. After all, who pays attention to Senate procedure in August? Who follows the arcane rules of confirmation hearings when there are vacations to take and barbecues to attend? They had misread one crucial thing. Someone was watching, someone who had grown up in the forgotten corners of America, who had seen what happens when powerful people stop caring about ordinary folks. Someone who had clawed his way from a broken home in Middletown, Ohio, to the second highest office in the land. And that someone wasn't going to stay silent. Vice President J.D. Vance had mostly stayed out of the headlines for months. He had done his job quietly, attending ceremonies and breaking tie votes, playing the traditional role of the nation's understudy. The media had almost forgotten about the firebrand author who had once shaken the political world with his unflinching memoir of Appalachian struggle. But that text message changed everything, and the leak that followed it pulled him forward from the shadows into the blinding spotlight of history. Standing alone in the West Wing, watching the story break on a glowing television screen, J.D. Vance felt something crystallize inside him. A cold clarity settled over his mind, the kind of focus that comes when you realize the moment for action has finally arrived. Enough, he told himself, his voice barely above a whisper in that empty room. The word echoed off the walls that had witnessed so many crucial moments in American history. Enough! The country deserved better than backroom vendettas and political assassination attempts disguised as procedure. The millions of Americans who had voted for change deserved to know what was being done in the shadows. The working families who had put their faith in this administration deserved a champion who would fight for them, even when the enemy wore the same party label. America was about to see something unprecedented, a takedown from inside, a move that nobody had dared attempt in years. The Vice President of the United States was about to expose the darkest secrets of his own party's most powerful figures. By 7 p.m., the White House briefing room was packed to capacity. Every seat was filled, and reporters stood 3 deep along the walls, their cameras and microphones creating a forest of technology pointed at the empty podium. The air crackled with an electric anticipation that veterans of the press corps said they hadn't felt in years. The buzz of speculation filled the room like static electricity before a lightning strike. Reporters exchanged theories in hushed, urgent voices. Ukraine policy? Immigration announcements? A cabinet shakeup? Nobody knew why they had been summoned with such urgency, only that Vice President Vance would speak. The usual suspects ran through their predictions. Some guessed it was about the border situation. Others speculated about economic announcements. A few cynics assumed it was just another routine statement that would barely make the evening news. They were all wrong. Then J.D. Vance walked in, and something in the room changed immediately. He carried no notes in his hands. There was no teleprompter positioned for his use. He walked with the measured pace of a man who had made a decision and accepted its consequences, whatever they might be. His expression was calm, controlled, and razor-sharp. His eyes swept across the assembled press corps with the focused intensity of someone who was about to cross a line that could never be uncrossed. The room fell into absolute silence. Even the soft clicking of camera shutters seemed to pause. Everyone could sense that something extraordinary was about to happen. "No teleprompters tonight," Vance said, his voice steady and clear. The words hung in the air like the first notes of a symphony. "I'm speaking straight to the American people." He let that pause settle over the room, allowing the weight of his opening statement to sink in. Every reporter leaned forward almost imperceptibly. Every camera operator tightened their shot. Then he added the words that would launch 1,000 headlines. "I have to expose something dangerous, something shameful that's come from our own side." A ripple of stunned murmurs passed through the press corps like a wave through still water. Reporters exchanged wide-eyed glances. Some began typing frantically on their phones, already sending alerts to their editors. This was not what anyone had expected. This was not normal. This was history in the making. Vance said he had proof, not rumors, not speculation, not anonymous sources that might evaporate under scrutiny. Actual documents, physical evidence, the kind of receipts that couldn't be explained away or dismissed as partisan attacks. He had documents showing that Senator Mitch McConnell and Majority Leader John Thune were actively sabotaging the Trump administration, not through legitimate political opposition, not through policy disagreements, but through calculated betrayal. And here was the part that would make this story burn across every platform in the nation. They weren't doing it for principle or for country. They were doing it for power, for personal revenge, for the settling of old scores that should have been buried long ago. "This is more than politics," Vance declared, his voice hardening like steel in a forge. "This is betrayal." With emotion that would be replayed millions of times in the hours to come, he slammed a folder onto the podium. The sound echoed through the briefing room like a gunshot. Cameras zoomed in on the thick manila folder, stuffed with what appeared to be hundreds of pages of documentation. "Inside this," he said, tapping the folder with his finger, "are years of secrets that Mitch McConnell hoped would stay buried forever. Secrets about deals made in darkness. Secrets about a vendetta that has poisoned our party and threatened our nation." The room buzzed with barely contained energy, but Vance kept going. He wasn't here to take questions. He wasn't here to engage in the usual back and forth of political theater. He was here to deliver a message, and nothing was going to stop him. He opened the folder and began to pull apart a hidden history that would shock the nation. He described a private meeting that had taken place years ago in the aftermath of President Trump's first election victory. The details were specific, the timeline precise. This wasn't vague accusation, this was documented reality. McConnell, Vance alleged, had demanded money, a payoff, cold hard cash, in exchange for loyalty to the new president. The veteran senator who had built his reputation as a master of procedure and a guardian of conservative principles had allegedly approached the president-elect with the kind of proposition that belongs in crime dramas, not the halls of American government. When Trump refused, Vance said, McConnell took it personally, deeply, bitterly, irrevocably personally. He told him, Vance recounted, his voice carrying the weight of the moment, I don't buy people, I earn their respect. That refusal, Vance claimed, became the seed of everything that followed. That single moment of principle, that refusal to play the corrupt games that had governed Washington for decades, had turned McConnell into an enemy. From that moment, Vance continued, McConnell set out to destroy him, not because of policy, not because of ideology, but because his ego couldn't accept being refused. He raised a printed email toward the cameras, dated and signed, with only the legally required redactions obscuring certain names and details. The document was real. The evidence was tangible. This wasn't political theater, this was prosecution-grade material. This isn't about policy, Vance said, his eyes locked on the cameras that would carry his words to millions of homes. It's about a man who couldn't accept being told no. A man who decided that if he couldn't own the president, he would destroy him. He went further, accusing McConnell of elevating John Thune into leadership, not on merit, not on vision, but on loyalty. Thune, the current majority leader, was allegedly nothing more than a puppet, placed in power specifically so McConnell could continue controlling the Senate levers even after stepping back from the leadership role himself. Reporters tried to cut in with questions, their hands shooting up, their voices starting to call out, but Vance held up a hand, stopping them cold. He wasn't finished, he had more to reveal, and the American people needed to hear it all. He peeled back more layers of this political onion, each revelation more damaging than the last. The folder, he explained, contained memos documenting secret strategy sessions, back-channel emails that showed coordination between supposed rivals, committee transcripts that had been kept hidden behind claims of privilege and procedure. One faded printout, he said, showed McConnell offering a bargain at a private dinner years ago. The terms were simple and corrupt. Help my allies with federal contracts, and I'll shield your agenda. Trump said no, Vance declared. He said he was there for the people, not for deals. And that's when they decided he had to be stopped. The atmosphere in the briefing room had shifted completely. The usual aggressive energy of the White House press corps had been replaced by something closer to collective shock. The hum of laptops and the scratch of pens seemed to pause as the magnitude of what was being alleged sank in. Vance accused McConnell of weaponizing the Senate itself, of pressuring colleagues with threats and promises, of orchestrating timing to maximum political effect, of using the recess extension as nothing more than a tool to freeze confirmations and paralyze the government. Judges nominated by the president, blocked. Cabinet nominees ready to serve, blocked. Military leaders needed to keep the nation safe, blocked. All of it, every single stalled nomination, was allegedly part of a coordinated scheme to cripple the presidency from within. The goal, Vance insisted, his voice rising with controlled anger, was to strangle the presidency from the inside, to make it impossible for this administration to function, to punish a president who refused to be bought. Then he turned his sights directly to John Thune, the man who currently held the title of Senate Majority Leader. He didn't get here by merit, Vance said, and you could have heard a pin drop in that room. He's there because he stayed loyal to McConnell's machine, because he agreed to be a puppet, because he was willing to do what he was told. A screen behind Vance flashed to life, displaying a timeline that would become one of the most viewed images in political history. Backroom meetings documented by date and location, whispered phone calls logged and transcribed, and what Vance called leaked audio from a 2023 retreat that showed McConnell personally grooming Thune for the role he now occupied. The message embedded in that timeline was blunt and unavoidable. Thune's move to extend the recess wasn't about procedure or principle. It was sabotage wrapped in parliamentary language. It was betrayal disguised as business as usual. Within minutes of Vance's revelations, the feed detonated across the internet. Clips began circulating on every platform, shared and reshared at a rate that would crash servers and set new records for engagement. People watched, stunned and silent, as the Vice President of the United States accused senior members of his own party of corruption and betrayal. Across the country, Americans reacted in real time to what they were witnessing. This wasn't just another political story to be consumed and forgotten by morning. This was different. This felt like a moment that would be remembered. In a modest farmhouse in rural Ohio, a weathered farmer wiped his calloused hand across his face and muttered to his wife, "About time, about damn time somebody said it." His television glowed in the gathering darkness, the only light in a room that had seen generations of hardship and hope. In Phoenix, Arizona, a retired veteran sat ramrod straight in his worn recliner, his eyes fixed on the screen. Medals from 3 wars hung on the wall behind him. When Vance finished speaking, the old soldier whispered, "God bless him," and felt something he hadn't felt in years, pride in a politician. In living rooms and diners, in truck stops and hospital break rooms, in tiny apartments and sprawling suburbs, the broadcast became the only headline that mattered. Dinner conversations stopped mid-sentence. Restaurant televisions drew crowds of strangers who stood together, watching history unfold. Vance drove the point home with words that would be quoted for years to come. "You don't undercut a president because he won't take a bribe," he said, his voice carrying the righteous anger of a man who had seen too much injustice in his life. "You don't stab voters in the back to protect your ego. You don't burn down the house because you weren't invited to the party." The words hit hard. In homes across America, tears and disbelief flickered on faces of all ages. What had started as politics had become unbearably personal. This wasn't about Republicans versus Democrats anymore. This was about whether the system itself could be trusted. This was about whether the people who claimed to serve the public were actually serving themselves. If you were watching this unfold in real time, sitting in your living room as J.D. Vance exposed decades of hidden corruption, what would be going through your mind? Would you feel vindicated that someone finally spoke up? Or would you wonder how deep the rot really goes? Share your thoughts in the comments. I want to know what this moment means to you. In his Senate office, Mitch McConnell sat stone-faced in the same leather chair he had occupied for decades. His phone buzzed constantly with calls from donors demanding explanations, allies seeking reassurance, and reporters hunting for comment. The device vibrated so frequently it seemed to dance across his desk. He had weathered storms before. 40 years in Washington teaches you how to survive almost anything. He told his assembled team to stay calm, to project confidence, to wait for the news cycle to move on. "He's bluffing," McConnell said, though even his most loyal staffers noticed something unfamiliar in his voice. "People will move on. They always do." But even he felt the moment's weight pressing down on him. This wasn't like other attacks he had survived. Vance hadn't just made accusations, he had placed dates, documents, and witnesses on the table. This was evidence, not rhetoric. This was the kind of material that couldn't be dismissed with a carefully crafted statement and a few phone calls to friendly media outlets. Outside the Capitol, something unprecedented was happening. People were gathering, not protesters organized by political action committees, not professional activists with printed signs, just ordinary Americans who had seen the broadcast and felt compelled to act. Demonstrations erupted in states across the nation. In Alabama, factory workers left their evening shifts early to gather outside the federal courthouse. In Missouri, farmers drove their trucks into town and parked in a silent vigil. Even in liberal pockets of New York, people who had never attended a political rally found themselves standing shoulder to shoulder with strangers, united by what they had witnessed. Signs appeared, scrawled on cardboard and poster board, "Let him work," "We stand with Trump," "Drain the swamp," "For real this time." A swelling chorus of Americans was rallying behind the president and Vance's revelations. The movement wasn't organized by any campaign or political party. It was organic, spontaneous, and growing by the minute. Back in the briefing room, Vance closed his initial presentation with a direct plea to the American people. "President Trump has accomplished more in 6 months than many do in 4 years, he said, and then began ticking off the achievements on his fingers. Jobs created in sectors that had been written off as dead. Trade deals renegotiated to protect American workers. Economic indicators turning in directions the experts said were impossible. He accused McConnell of trying to erase all of that progress with what he called a manufactured vacation, a political maneuver disguised as Senate procedure, designed to halt an administration mid-stride and prevent any more victories for the American people. When the cameras finally cut away from the briefing room, The country was reeling. What was meant to be a quiet Friday in Washington had exploded into a public unpeeling of grudges and deals that stretched back decades. The Capitol was shaken to its foundations, and the nation was left wondering what would happen next. Just when it seemed the evening couldn't get more explosive, J.D. Vance reached into his jacket pocket and lifted a small envelope toward the camera. The manila paper looked ordinary, even mundane, but what it contained would send another shockwave across the nation. "This," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was about to reveal, "is a transcript of a private meeting. Bernie Sanders and Mitch McConnell, March 2024, a backroom on Capitol Hill." Gasps swept through the press room like wind through wheat. Bernie Sanders, the progressive senator from Vermont who had built his career railing against everything McConnell represented. What possible business could those two have conducted together? Vance turned the page so the lights caught the heading, letting the cameras zoom in on the document. The transcript showed something that would shatter assumptions on both sides of the political spectrum. Bernie Sanders had allegedly promised not to interfere in McConnell's internal party fight. In exchange, McConnell would make sure President Trump couldn't confirm conservative judges during this term. Two men who claimed to represent opposite ends of the political spectrum, working together in secret to subvert the will of the voters. "You heard that right," Vance said, letting the words sink in. "Bernie cut a deal with Mitch. Two enemies on camera, allies in the shadows. All to stall the country's progress, all to stop a president they both feared." The room seemed to tilt on its axis. Across the nation, people sat with mouths open, struggling to process what they were hearing. In a small house in Michigan, an elderly woman who had voted in every election since Kennedy sat in her favorite chair, a cup of tea growing cold in her hands. One slow tear fell down her weathered cheek as she whispered to nobody in particular, "They lied! All of them! They lied to us for years!" Vance's eyes locked with the camera, speaking directly to every American who felt betrayed by what they were learning. "No more secret pacts," he declared. "No more sabotage. No more swamp." He paused, letting the silence hang in the briefing room like the calm before a storm. "We clean house tonight." And outside the White House, outside the Capitol, in cities and towns across America, something that had been held back for years finally let go. Thousands flooded into streets across America with flags and candles and hand-lettered signs. The gatherings weren't violent. They weren't angry mobs demanding destruction. They were something far more powerful, ordinary people who had finally found their voice. "We stand with Trump and JD" read signs in Florida and Montana, in Texas and Maine. The movement had no organizers, no central committee, no talking points. It was simply Americans responding to what felt like a moment of truth in a political landscape that had been filled with lies for too long. In shopping malls, televisions that usually played advertisements were switched to news coverage. Shoppers stopped with bags in hand, drawn into circles around the screens. At airports, travelers gathered around departure gate monitors. Flights were missed, connections were ignored, nothing else mattered. In Florida, a retired sailor who had served his country for 30 years stood in his living room and saluted his television. His wife found him there, tears streaming down his face, his hand held rigid against his forehead. In Ohio, a mother knelt beside her young son and pointed to the screen. "That man," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "that's courage. Remember what courage looks like." On social media, hashtags exploded across every platform. Vance exposes McConnell. Save our president. JD for the people. The algorithms couldn't keep up with the volume of engagement. In the White House press room, J.D. Vance did not look away from the cameras. Tears swelled in his eyes, visible to millions watching across the nation, but he didn't break. He didn't apologize for his emotion. He let it stand as testament to how much this moment meant. "This is no longer just politics," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of genuine feeling. "This is about your families, your paychecks, your schools, your children's futures. Everything they told you was separate from Washington. It's all connected, and they've been lying to you about it for decades." He opened another folder, this one filled with charts and graphs that told a story of achievement that had been deliberately hidden from the public. "This is what President Trump has delivered in 189 days, he announced, and the numbers began to splash across the screen behind him. Manufacturing jobs reclaimed from overseas, brought back to American factories, housing projects for veterans who had been living on the streets, tightened border measures that had reduced illegal crossings by percentages that the previous administration had claimed were impossible, falling pump prices that put money back in working families' pockets, revived farm subsidies that gave hope to agricultural communities written off as economically dead. "Real figures," Vance insisted, his voice rising with conviction. Real change, real results for real Americans. While some play political games in Washington, he builds. While they scheme in back rooms, he delivers. For many viewers, even those who had approached the evening with skepticism, the list landed like a hand on a shoulder. This wasn't just a speech. It wasn't just political theater. It felt like a call to arms, a summoning of something that had been dormant in the American spirit. Vance's breath caught for a moment, and he unfolded a yellowed letter, its edges brittle with age. The paper trembled slightly in his hands as he held it up to the light. "This is a handwritten note from Mitch McConnell to a foreign lobbyist," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "March 2001, almost 25 years ago." He held it up so cameras could zoom in on the faded ink, the cramped handwriting, the incriminating words. The letter suggested steering military contracts in return for campaign help. It hinted at influencing Senate votes behind closed doors. It documented a pattern of corruption that stretched back decades, long before most Americans had any idea what was happening in the corridors of power. Vance's hand trembled as he held the document, not from fear, but from a kind of furious sorrow. "This wasn't isolated corruption," he said, his voice hardening. "This was a pattern, a way of doing business. The man who now leads the charge to impeach the president has been making deals like this when no one was watching for longer than some of you have been alive. He doesn't play by the same rules," Vance continued, and now there was fire in his eyes. "That's why they fear him. That's why they want him out. Not because he's broken any laws, not because he's failed the American people, but because he won't play their games, because he won't be bought, because he actually means what he says." Reporters in the room could be heard catching their breath. One pen clattered to the floor, its owner too stunned to notice. Another journalist whispered, "Oh my God!" just loud enough to be picked up by nearby microphones. "The difference is clear," Vance continued, his gaze sweeping across the assembled press corps. "One fights for the people, the other fights for himself. One builds, the other schemes. One keeps his promises, the other breaks them before the ink is dry." Across towns and cities, people reacted to the broadcast with raw, unfiltered emotion. Some sobbed openly, overwhelmed by the weight of what they were hearing. Some chanted at their televisions as if Vance could hear their support through the screen. Many simply stared with faces rearranged by disbelief, trying to process a reality that had suddenly become much more complicated than they had imagined. For a moment, Vance's composure seemed to waver. He wiped his cheek with the back of his hand, not hiding the emotion but acknowledging it. "This is more than politics," he said, his voice going small and personal. "It's about the country I grew up in, the country my grandmother fought to survive in, the country I barely recognize now when I watch what happens in this city." He spoke of his small-town upbringing in Middletown, Ohio, of hard work and simple values, of neighbors who helped each other through hard times and never asked for recognition, of an America where your word meant something and a handshake was a contract. "That was the kind of America the president stands up for," Vance said. "But men like Mitch," his voice hardened with barely contained anger, "they forgot us. They traded our futures for their comfort. They made deals that enriched themselves while our towns crumbled and our factories closed and our children lost hope." The briefing room was hushed. Flashbulbs popped like distant lightning. Every person in that room understood they were witnessing something that would be studied and debated for years to come. Vance dropped his voice to a personal plea, abandoning the cadence of political speech for something raw and more human. "I won't be quiet while they try to destroy the man fighting for all of us," he said. "If I fall for speaking that truth, then so be it. Some things are worth falling for." Across the nation, people wept openly. The speech had threaded itself into the fabric of a country already frayed by years of division and distrust. But for the first time in a long time, many Americans felt like someone in power was finally telling them the truth. Back in the Capitol, the corridors buzzed with frantic energy. The carefully maintained facade of senatorial dignity had crumbled. John Thune, long seen as McConnell's hand-picked successor and loyal protege, stood pale and trembling in a narrow hallway, surrounded by angry senators demanding answers. "You let him hijack our party," one senator said through clenched teeth, his finger jabbing toward Thune's chest. "You knew what he was doing, and you helped him do it. You betrayed us all." Another spat, his face flushed with fury. Thune fumbled for a response, his usual smooth confidence completely evaporated. The moment had slipped away from him, like sand through desperate fingers. On screen, Vance continued his systematic dismantling of the McConnell machine. He rolled out more documents, each one more damaging than the last. There were records tracing money, through shadowy channels, funds that had somehow found their way from foreign sources into accounts connected to McConnell's political operations. There was a leaked clip of McConnell mocking those who supported the president, his voice dripping with contempt for the very voters who had put Republicans in power, and there was proof that Tune's rise had been manufactured, not earned. Documents showing how McConnell had systematically cleared the path for his protégé, removing rivals and calling in favors to ensure that his chosen successor would take the reins of leadership. Mitch didn't just mentor Thune, Vance said, his voice cutting like a blade. He engineered him, created him, programmed him to follow orders without question. The betrayal felt personal to millions of Americans who had assumed the enemy wore a different color tie. When the speech ended, Vance stepped back from the microphone, exhausted and visibly shaking. The weight of what he had revealed sat heavy on his shoulders, but there was something else in his expression too. Relief. The truth was finally out. Outside the White House, the crowd had swelled beyond anything the Secret Service had anticipated. Farmers and veterans, nurses and small business owners, teachers and truck drivers. They arrived carrying homemade signs that spoke to a hope that had been rekindled. "We believe. Thank you, JD. Enough is enough." From a West Wing window, Vance watched the gathering crowd, tears tracking down his face as the mass of humanity continued to grow. A little girl on the lawn below raised a hand-painted sign that read, "JD, you gave my daddy hope." Her voice, impossibly small, yet somehow carrying through the summer air, called out, "We love you!" In that instant, Vance felt something larger than politics. A country he had thought was invisible, forgotten, written off by the powers that be, was suddenly looking back at him. They saw him, he saw them. Before we continue, take a second and share your thoughts so far on this story below. I read every single one. Later that evening, in a quiet wing of the Capitol building, Vance found himself face to face with the man he had just publicly destroyed. Mitch McConnell stood waiting, his cane gripped tightly in one hand, his eyes hard with something that might have been fear or fury or both. "You think that speech makes you a hero?" McConnell hissed, his voice barely above a whisper, but sharp as broken glass. Vance didn't flinch. "It makes the truth visible," Vance replied, his voice calm and steady. "That's all I ever wanted." "You've split the party," McConnell warned. "You split us long ago," Vance shot back. And there was heat in his words now. "When you chose money over duty? When you decided that power was more important than the people you claimed to serve?" The old senator's hand quivered on his cane. "You use people as pawns," Vance continued, pressing forward. "You turn power into a private game. You've forgotten what it means to serve." McConnell said nothing more. There was nothing left to say. Vance left the corridor behind him, his coat sweeping as he walked. The place where they had stood felt irrevocably changed. In a cold, struggling town in West Virginia, the Thompson family sat close together on a tattered couch, watching the news coverage with the rest of the country. The father had been recently laid off from the factory that had employed 3 generations of his family. The mother worked double shifts at the hospital. Their son was just 10 years old, sitting cross-legged in front of the television, watching J.D. Vance's words play over and over. "Is he telling the truth, Daddy?" the boy asked, his voice small and uncertain. The father blinked back tears. "Yes," the father said finally, putting his arm around his wife. "Yes, he's telling the truth. He's fighting for us." The mother gripped her husband's hand a little harder. "I've never heard anyone speak like that." Across towns and counties, blue and red, wealthy and struggling, the scene repeated itself. Families wept together. Grandparents squeezed each other's hands. Single mothers whispered half in prayer and half in relief. This had stopped being about party labels. It felt, somehow, like someone had finally put words to what ordinary Americans had been carrying in their hearts for years. Within an hour of Vance's speech, something remarkable happened. His legal defense fund exploded online. Donations poured in from every corner of the country, not big-dollar checks, but small contributions of $10, $20, $50 from people who could barely afford it but felt compelled to act. Volunteers signed up by the thousands. People didn't just watch what was happening, they felt seen, because J.D. Vance didn't sound like a polished politician reading from a teleprompter. He sounded like a man who had nothing to gain except a chance to protect a future for ordinary folks. He sounded like them. The Senate chamber that day was packed beyond its usual capacity. Every chair held a senator. Every gallery seat was filled with observers who had pulled every string possible to witness what was about to unfold. Streams of viewers at home shattered cable records as C-SPAN's numbers spiked to unprecedented levels. People who had never watched a minute of Senate proceedings were now glued to their screens. J.D. Vance slipped in through a side entrance, deliberately avoiding the main doors where cameras would have captured his arrival. He carried no retinue of aides, no stack of printed remarks, Just a steady face and an unshakable sense of purpose. Mitch McConnell sat near the front of the chamber, pretending to study papers that he clearly wasn't reading. John Thune lingered behind him, pale and stiff as a statue. J.D. Vance walked to the center microphone. The chamber fell silent so completely that senators later said they could hear the air conditioning system cycling in distant parts of the building. His voice was quiet when he began, but it carried to every corner of that historic room like a bell tolling. "Mr. President, members of the Senate," he said, using the formal address the tradition demanded. "There are moments when staying quiet becomes complicity, when silence makes you part of the problem. Tonight, I will not be quiet." He paused, letting his gaze travel slowly across the assembled senators. "You all saw the broadcast. You know the facts now. You've seen the documents. But if you expect this to end here, you're mistaken." He turned slowly, deliberately, until he was facing Mitch McConnell directly. "I've filed a motion asking the Senate to open an internal ethics probe into Senator McConnell," Vance announced. "The affidavits are ready, the financial documents have been submitted, they outline a long pattern of corruption stretching back decades." The chamber inhaled as one, a collective gasp that seemed to suck all the air out of the room. McConnell said nothing, his face remained frozen, but the evidence had been placed on the table now, and everyone in that chamber knew that no mask could protect him from what was coming. Security officers appeared at the edges of the chamber. Minutes later, McConnell was escorted from the floor. Outside his office, a different scene was unfolding. John Thune burst through the door, his voice sharp. "You told me those records were buried," Thune accused. "You promised me there was nothing that could come back." McConnell sat in his chair, suddenly seeming smaller than he ever had before. "I built this party," the old senator whispered. Thune's response was cold as ice. "You poisoned it. Before we go deeper, I would love to hear your point of view. Tell me what part hit you the hardest in the story, and share your thoughts in the comments." That evening, without a prepared speech, J.D. Vance faced a ring of cameras for what felt like the 100th time. That day, "To every American watching tonight," he said, his voice catching with emotion, "you are not forgotten, you are not invisible, you matter, your families matter, your struggles matter." He spoke of grocery bills that never seemed to stop rising, of factories that had once been the heartbeat of communities now standing empty, of veterans who had returned from war to find that the country they had served had forgotten them. "For too long, men in power have used their offices to silence you. That ends now." And the country wept, not from weakness, but from relief, because someone had finally spoken plainly for them. By morning, the ripple had become a tidal wave. J.D.'s remarks were played across every network. Citizens called their representatives and demanded action. A veteran in Arizona called his congressman's office and broke down crying, "I've never heard a leader speak like that. Tell him thank you." A coalition of younger GOP senators publicly withdrew their support for McConnell. One by one, they declared that the matter was larger than party loyalty. From the Rose Garden weeks later, J.D. Vance addressed a swelling crowd. He held a worn photograph in his hands. "This is my grandfather," he said. "He was a coal miner who worked himself into illness and poverty. He never complained. He just did what he had to do to take care of his family. That's who I fight for, not billionaires or lobbyists, but the families they forget." Then came another bombshell. A leaked recording hit the airwaves, McConnell's voice urging any leverage to destroy a political rival. When McConnell finally emerged to speak, he offered no apology, just, "It's politics." J.D.'s response was instant. "This is betrayal of the people and of the Constitution." Inside the White House, President Trump watched J.D.'s presentations on loop. Looking out over a lawn filled with signs and flags, he murmured, "He did it," he called J.D. "You defended the soul of the country." For once the president's composure cracked with a single tear. Late into the night, another tape surfaced, McConnell strategizing to ride and then silence an emotional base. J.D. played the clip for the country. "This is how they talk about you," he said. He unfolded handwritten notes from truck drivers, teachers, single parents. "They mock you off camera and then come on TV asking for your vote. That ends tonight," reporters demanded. "Is this criminal?" "Yes, I filed the request with the DOJ." As midnight approached, J.D. stepped onto the Truman balcony. Thousands waited below. "No speech," he told them. "I just need to speak from the heart. My mother struggled, my father wasn't there, I've buried people to drugs and despair." He pointed toward the White House. "This house belongs to you, not to men who hide behind power. One man grew rich while ignoring those losses. He won't win, not while I breathe." The crowd answered with a tearful roar. "At an emergency Senate Judiciary session," J.D. set a black folder on the table. "Bank records tied to Senator McConnell. Over the past decade, more than $28 million from foreign contractors. He displayed a transfer memo with McConnell's signature. If you want to know what threatens our democracy, look at this. John Thune stopped beside McConnell in the corridor. It's over. McConnell stared at the ceiling, saying nothing. J.D. closed his statement. I didn't come for revenge. I came to shine a light. This is for everyone who believes leaders should serve the people instead of selling them. He left to thunderous applause. Outside, thousands clutched photos and homemade signs. A single chant rose, for us, for truth. That night, J.D. read a letter from an elderly widow in Georgia. I lost my husband, I lost my house. Tonight I found hope again. On live television, he told the nation, this fight isn't finished, but we've begun something Washington hasn't seen in a long time: accountability. President Trump fights for the forgotten. I'll keep fighting with him. For every miner, nurse, single mom, and soldier who was passed over. To those who betrayed the country from within, your time is up. When the Senate convened, a senator rose. Madam Chair, I move to open formal censure proceedings. The gavel fell hard. In Ohio, a mailman delivered a note from a father who lost his son. Tonight, I told my boy someone stood up for him. J.D. held it and felt like the kid from Middletown he'd once been. He went live one last time. I didn't do this alone. I carried your voices. Across the country, people wept, not for scandal, but for a chance at repair. Churches held vigils, schools gathered, towns talked. President Trump stood beside J.D. You didn't just defend me, you defended America. J.D. addressed everyone watching. This is your country. Don't let anyone tell you it's too late to take it back. Crowds linked arms. For the first time in a long while, people felt seen, heard, and painfully, stubbornly free. And that's where we leave this incredible story today. What J.D. Vance did took courage that most of us can only imagine. He stood up against the most powerful forces in his own party, risked everything he had built, and told the truth when it would have been so much easier to stay quiet. This story reminds us that accountability is possible. That truth can still win. That ordinary people, when they stand together, have the power to change everything. If this story moved you, if you felt something while watching this unfold, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me what part hit you the hardest. Was it J.D.'s speech about his grandfather? The moment he confronted McConnell? The letters from ordinary Americans who finally felt heard? Thank you so much for watching until the end. It means the world to me that you're here, part of this community at Celebrity Chronicles. If you haven't already, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Celebrity Chronicles. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Share it with someone who's lost hope. Share it with someone who needs to know that the truth still matters in America. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other. This is your country. Never stop fighting for it.